is Alyssa Bruno, and I'm the School Programming Coordinator here at Historic Huguenot Street. Welcome to another digital read-along. Last week, we read the first part of If You Lived When Women Won Their Rights by Anne Kama with permission of Scholastic Books. If you have not already watched the first installment of this reading, check out the video from last Monday morning on our Facebook page. In the first segment, we learned about the roles of women in the American Revolution, what America was like in the 1800s, and the obstacles and inequalities that women faced in American society. We also learned about some of the first movements that formed in response to these injustices. Today, we will pick up by learning more about the development of the women's rights movement. What started the women's rights movement? When Elizabeth Cady Stanton married, she and her husband, Henry, went to London so Henry could go to the World Anti-Slavery Convention. On the first day, a fight broke out over whether women should be allowed to take part in the convention. Women shouldn't go to public meetings, some argued. They should stay at home where they belong. Ministers waved their Bibles and said that God made woman to obey man. Some yelled, "Turn the women out." The women were not allowed to speak. When the vote was taken, most of the men voted to keep women out. They were taken to a segregated section where they could watch, but not speak. The women were furious about the way they had been treated. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott decided to do something about it when they returned home to America. What did the women do? In the summer of 1848, Lucretia Mott came to Seneca Falls, New York, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived. Now, Elizabeth thought, was the time to have a women's rights convention, the first one ever. Together with 3 other women, Elizabeth and Lucretia planned the convention for the following Wednesday, July 19th. The rush was on. They put an ad in the local paper and sat down to plan the meeting. They knew they had to explain what women wanted. But how should they write it? Elizabeth had the answer. Write it like the Declaration of Independence. After all, weren't women declaring their independence? Weren't all men and women created equal? They also wrote a list of important ideas they wanted the people at the convention to vote on. Now they were ready. Did anybody show up? Lucretia Mott was worried. It was the haying season, so farmers were busy, and the ad had been in the newspaper for only a week. Would anybody show up? On the morning of their convention, there was just a few carts on the road at first, but soon vehicles of all kinds appeared. Horse-drawn wagons, fancy pony carts, farm wagons, all heading toward Seneca Falls. By the time they reached town, the roads were jammed. 19-year-old Charlotte Woodward came with her friends. She worked in her bedroom sewing for a glove factory because women weren't supposed to work outside the home. When she was paid, her father kept the money. She didn't think that was fair at all. Every fiber of my being rebelled, she remembered. A huge crowd, mostly women, gathered outside the Wesleyan Chapel, where the convention was to be held. When the doors opened, people rushed in and filled every seat. What happened at the Seneca Falls Convention? There must have been a lot of excitement in the audience. This was the first women's rights convention ever held anywhere in the world, and women were going to speak to an audience with men in it. Everything went well the first day. First, Lucretia Mott explained to the audience why a women's movement was necessary. Then, Elizabeth Cady Stanton read the Declaration of Sentiments, which was a list of all the wrongs done by men to women in 1848. Women have no voice in their government. Colleges are closed to women. Women have no right to their children. Women's husbands take their property and wages. Men keep all the high-paying jobs for themselves. Elizabeth was nervous. This was the first time she had ever spoken in front of an audience. As she read, however, her voice became stronger and stronger. But would the audience vote to approve the Declaration of Sentiments? The convention organizers held their breath. Yes, came the answer. Afterward, many of the people in the audience signed their names to the Declaration of Sentiments. Was there trouble at the convention? The next day, Elizabeth read the list of important ideas and asked the audience to vote on them. Did everyone agree that men and women were created equal? Yes. Did they agree that women should be allowed to speak in public? Yes. Did they agree that women should be allowed to speak out in church? Yes. As Elizabeth went down the list, the audience agreed with everything except one question. Did everyone agree that women should have the right to vote? Even Lucretia Mott worried that asking for the right to vote might make the convention look silly. Elizabeth's husband had already left town, so people wouldn't think he agreed with such a ridiculous idea. An argument broke out. Angry words were spoken, but Elizabeth refused to back down. "The right is ours," she said. "Have it we must. Use it we will." Just when it looked as if the audience might vote no, Frederick Douglass rose to speak. Everyone knew who he was, the great abolitionist leader who had been a slave. Without the vote, he argued, there is no freedom. That is true for black and white, men and women. In the end, most of the audience voted yes. What did the newspapers say? Most newspapers had only bad things to say about the Seneca Falls Convention. They called the leaders monsters. Wanting equal rights with men, the paper said, was dangerous and ridiculous. Women belonged in the home. "A woman is nobody. A wife is everything," one Philadelphia newspaper reporter wrote. And it wasn't just the newspapers. Ministers and neighbors, even friends, attacked the convention. Only a few newspapers, such as the New York Tribune and the abolitionist papers, supported the women. Were the people from the convention upset? They were very upset. No one had expected such an attack. Some were so embarrassed that they had their names removed from the Declaration of Sentiments. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's own sister, Harriet Eaton, was forced by her husband to remove her name. Others refused to go to any more women's meetings. They were afraid of seeing their names in the newspapers. Most of the women still believed in women's rights, but many felt like the wife of Senator William Seward. "I'm with you thoroughly, but I'm born a coward. There is nothing I dread more than Mr. Seward's ridicule." Was the convention a failure? Elizabeth Cady Stanton didn't think so. After all, the women's movement had finally begun, the first in the world, and the leaders were already planning to have another convention in just 2 weeks. Even the terrible newspaper articles helped, Elizabeth thought. Before the convention, almost nobody had talked about women's rights. Now the whole country was talking. You couldn't open a newspaper without reading about it. Some papers had printed the whole Declaration of Sentiments. "It will start women thinking, and men too," she said, "and that is the first step." Who was the leader of the new movement? Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The Seneca Falls Convention made her famous, and to her own surprise, she turned out to be a great speaker. Something else made her a good leader. She could think on her feet. When people all around her became angry, she stayed cool and always had a good answer. Elizabeth was also smart. She read books on law, history, philosophy, science, and politics. In fact, if she had been a man, she probably would have become an important judge or senator. But Elizabeth had a problem. She was a mother with children and a house to take care of. She didn't have time to travel across the country to conventions. That's why it was lucky she met Susan B. Anthony. Susan did have time. She wasn't married, so she could leave home whenever she wanted. What happened when Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton became a team? Fireworks. They became one of the greatest teams in American history. Susan B. Anthony was a genius at organizing. She arranged every part of a meeting, rented an auditorium, got the flyers printed, planned the program, raised money, and hired excellent speakers. She was also great at finding new ways to make politicians pay attention. But Susan was not good at writing speeches and articles. Elizabeth was good at writing, and she was a daring thinker. Her articles were published in newspapers and magazines all over America. So Susan organized, and Elizabeth stayed home and wrote Susan's speeches, as well as other kinds of writing. Only rarely did Elizabeth go out and make her own speeches. That had to wait until her children were a little older. Did any men support women's rights? Many did. Some were abolitionists, like Frederick Douglass, who fought to end slavery. Others were Quakers. There were also men who simply thought women were being treated unfairly. One man gave $5,000 to the women's movement when he saw how much his married daughter suffered because of unfair marriage laws. Horace Greeley, who owned the New York Tribune, sometimes supported women's rights. He printed articles by Elizabeth Cady Stanton in his newspaper. But in the 1800s, most men were against women's rights. Did the marriage laws change? Yes. In 1860, after years of hard work by the women's movement, some of the laws were changed. Now a woman could keep the money she earned. She didn't have to give it to her husband. And now she could own things. Her husband wasn't allowed to take them or sell them. Best of all, children now belong to both parents, not just the father. The first state to change the laws was New York, but soon other states followed. It was a big victory for women. For the first time, a married woman wasn't penniless and had equal rights to her children. Why did it take so long to change the laws? If you can vote, you have power. Politicians have to listen to you because they need your vote. But women couldn't vote in the 1800s. So, when they asked a politician to change the laws, he didn't have to pay attention. So, how did women get men to change the laws? By making speeches, reading articles, and holding women's rights conventions. Little by little, more and more people agreed that women should have the equal rights. Women also got thousands of people to sign petitions asking the government to change the laws. And when the lawmakers refused to act, the women came back the next year with more petitions. Finally, after many years, the laws were changed. What happened when women first wore pants? Amelia Bloomer was amazed when she saw what Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her cousin Elizabeth Smith Miller were wearing. Pants. Amelia immediately sewed herself a pair. No women had dared to wear pants before. When Amelia wrote about her new pants in her newspaper, The Lily, hundreds of women sent letters asking for information about how to make them. Amelia printed the sewing instructions, and soon women all over America were wearing the new pants. Amelia Bloomer became so famous that the pants were called bloomers. Women working on farms and in factories, even women pioneers on the Oregon Trail, liked the freedom of bloomers. But women didn't like the jeering boys and men who followed them in the streets, sometimes throwing eggs and stones at them. Newspapers made fun of bloomer girls, and ministers told women that wearing pants was against God's will. Wearing the pants means being the one who runs things. In those days, most men thought they, not women, should run things. Cartoons made fun of husbands whose wives wore pants. Women's friends and family also didn't like the new fashion. Elizabeth Cady Stanton's sister burst into tears when she heard Elizabeth was wearing bloomers. Elizabeth's sons begged her not to visit them in school. Lucy Stone and Susan B. Anthony were trapped by a mob of taunting men on a New York City street and had to be rescued. The teasing got so bad that, in the end, women gave up wearing the comfortable pants. But that wasn't the end of the bloomer story. 30 years later, the bloomer craze came back. It was all because of the invention of the bicycle. When bicycles first came out, only men rode them. Women were told they might hurt themselves if they rode a bicycle. Some men just didn't like the idea of giving women so much freedom. One city even had a law against women riding bicycles on the streets. That all changed in the 1890s. Women and girls decided to ride bicycles anyway. And the best costume for bicycle riding was, you guessed it, bloomers. This time, people didn't laugh and throw things when women wore pants. But women could wear their bloomers only when they went bicycling. Afterwards, they had to go back to their long skirts. What was different about the West? Pioneer women were respected for their hard work. Men knew that without their wives, their homesteads might fail. So they treated women more like equals. And there were very few women in the West, so men were really glad when a woman settled nearby. Women did new things in the West. They ran their own ranches and farms. Some became cowgirls, sheriffs, mayors, and judges. Girls were free to do more, too. Eunice Norris, an African-American cowgirl, helped her family build their log cabin in Colorado. Agnes Cleveland became a great rider, even though she had to ride side saddle, as girls did in those days. One newspaper declared that Agnes and a man named Three-Fingered Pete were the best riders in the country. Thank you guys for tuning in and reading the second part of If You Lived When Women Won Their Rights with me today. If you want your very own copy of If You Lived When Women Won Their Rights, you can purchase it in our online shop. Starting today through May 3rd, you will receive 10% off the book's original price of $7.99 at checkout. This will bring the cost of the book to $7.19 before taxes and shipping. If you live locally, you can arrange to come pick the book up instead of having it shipped. Thank you for your interest in Historic Huguenot Street. I hope to see you again next Monday at 10 a.m. for the final reading of If You Lived When Women Won Their Rights.